just talk about anything. You say we, meaning human beings, are the only ones who can invent new things. Talk a little bit about that idea. If people have read the book, they know it. But you know, the vertical and the horizontal that you refer to in the book as a principal thesis of entrepreneurship.
Well, yes, I believe there's sort of, I outlined two basic ways that we have progress as a society, and one is what I describe as horizontal or extensive growth, which involves copying things that work. And this is most evidently seen through globalization in the last 40, 50 years. And then the other one is sort of intensive or vertical progress, doing new things. And this is sort of iconically seen in technology or new inventions or things like that. And I think these are two sort of modalities of progress that I contrast. And I think for those of us living in the United States, Western Europe, in the advanced countries, my claim is that the second is much more important than the first. Globalization is perhaps good if you're in Burkina Faso or in China or places where you have a lot of catching up to do. It's not how we're going to improve living standards in the West.
Now, when you say globalization, just to be clear, when I read that in the book, it wasn't immediately clear to me what you meant. And in case there's anybody not getting that, you mean, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, that just to sort of spread what we have, right? In other words, not to take what we have in the West and the best of the West and to get it into every corner of China or any part of the world. That's what you mean, effectively.
Yeah, I mean in the standard sense. I mean, it means all these different things, but it's basically sort of homogenization of the world, convergence, things becoming the same. When you describe the world as the developed and developing world, that is a globalization narrative. The developing countries are the ones that are going to become developed by copying and converging. And then it's also an anti-tech narrative, because the developed world is a place where nothing new is going to happen. It's developed, it's done, it's finished. And this is very different from the way we would have described the world 50 years ago, when we would have described it in terms of the first world and the third world. And the third world was permanently screwed up, and the first world was the one that was technologically advancing. And so we're living in a world that is extremely pro-globalization, that has bet everything on globalization, and that is not at all that excited about progress in other forms. And my underlying thesis is that we've had relatively little progress in technology, broadly defined, in the West in the last 50 years. There's perhaps been a narrow zone of progress around the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet. Even that we can get into debates as to whether it's positive or negative, that you sort of alluded to a little bit in the intro, and I'm not trying to take you up on that, but but certainly.
I just said that because I don't care.
Certainly, most engineering fields were bad fields for people to go in the Western world in the last 40 or 50 years. If you didn't want to become a mechanical engineer, chemical engineer, electrical engineering was already on its way out when I was at Stanford in the late 80s. And certainly, if you were so stupid as to become an aeroastro engineer or nuclear engineer, that was a bad idea, a full stop, for the last 40, 50 years. And I think, I do think that a lot of the challenges and problems we have in our society is that we are no longer progressing as fast as we're often told.
You make this case really strongly, and I was just staggered by, I don't mean to cut you off, but you just make this statement in the book that in a way, since 1970, we haven't progressed much. And when I read that, I thought, that's the first thing I want to ask you. In other words, when you're talking about not much happening in 50 years, I sort of get it, but tell us what you mean by that, and at some point you can bring up Apollo 11 and Woodstock as you did last night, because it was a very fascinating way of framing the whole thing, I thought.
Well, I'm not saying there's been zero progress in the last 50 years, but outside of the world of computers, there's not been much. And if you were, the main function of our iPhone seemed to be to distract us from the way in which we're in subways that are 100 years old, and the ways in which nothing in the rest of the world has changed or progressed very much. And if you look at cars or houses or things like this, haven't changed that much in the last 20, 30 years. Maybe 70s were still a little bit different, but it has not it's not progressed very much at all. There's, I think there's a meta level of question you could ask, which is that, in science we measure Avogadro's number, the fine structure constant in physics, to many, many significant figures. But the question of the progress of science, how fast it is progressing, is it accelerating, is it decelerating, is it relatively stagnant, never gets asked. And if it gets asked, we get nothing but short propagandistic answers from, let's say, university presidents who will tell us, using adverbs and as a substitute for thought, that clearly and demonstrably science is progressing faster than ever before. I think it is instead rather stuck. And we can go through sort of any of a number of places where things have fallen way short of expectation. Nixon declared war on cancer in 1970. It was going to be defeated by the bicentennial by 1976. So we're fast forward 50 years. We're presumably 50 years closer to curing cancer than we were 50 years ago, but the expected time has gone up quite a bit.
Well, you can't forget that LBJ declared war on poverty in 1965. So that was really meant mainly as a joke. But when you say that Nixon, I really have to say I'm hugely fascinated by, you are a science guy, and so I want to hear more from you about this, because when we think of, we were talking about this last night, the Manhattan Project, the Apollo project, put a man on the moon, those were times when people came together and accomplished extraordinary things. There's just no way around it. And obviously, since then, you're right, we don't seem to have done anything like that. But is there really nothing we can think of? I mean, would the Human Genome Project at least impress you a little bit?
A little bit, although I'd say it fooled me a lot, since I thought it would translate it into all sorts of cures by now, 20 plus years later.
Right.
And so there's always sort of a question how this actually translates. And we can, I think even if we say that things are progressing at roughly the same rate, I think that they're slower, they're objectively slower. Life expectancy is not going up anymore. This would be like one way to measure progress in medicine is how fast is life expectancy going up. Last 3 years it's actually been going down, which is, like even someone as pessimistic as me would have never predicted that it actually would go backwards, because surely, we might progress more slowly.
It's scary. That's scary to hear that.
I think one of the things there's sort of the failure, the question, why has this happened, or what changed, what went wrong, is always a little bit overdetermined. But certainly one cut on it is that big science is something like an oxymoron. And when you make it big, it stops being science. We have probably about 100 times as many people today in the world or in the United States who have PhDs in the sciences as in 1920. If progress was happening still at the same rate as in 1920, you would infer that the productivity of the average scientist is 99% less than it was 100 years ago. And I think it's even worse than that. So one partial history I would tell of what happened is that we had sort of a decentralized, healthy, scientific world before the New Deal. And it was heterodox, it was science as discovery, not science. I always think you have science as discovery, which is sort of the science one now only reads about in children's books on Einstein, sort of like a creative person thinks of new things. And then there's science as governance, where it's sort of, you're a robot in a lab and that's what you do. And most of science is science as governance, not science as discovery.
So what?
And so part of my history of what happened is that in the 1940s with the Manhattan Project, it was possible to take this pre-existing healthy system and accelerate it one time only. The New York Times, I'm going to paraphrase this, but this was about 4 or 5 days after the Hiroshima bomb. The op-ed in the New York Times was, hopefully this will silence the sort of conservative and libertarian people who said that the Army could not ever direct scientists and just tell them what to do, because the Army has proven all these people wrong, and hopefully they will now be quiet, because they were able to get a new invention to the world in 3.5 short years of the bomb, that if you'd left these prima donna scientists to their own devices, it might have taken them 50 years. Wow. So now I will say the New York Times doesn't write editorials like that anymore today. And I think part of the history is you were able to accelerate science one time by pouring money into it and scaling it, but then it came at the price of completely corrupting the institutions. It still worked with NASA and Apollo, but At this point, it is all just a slow bureaucracy. It's peer review, never have any heterodox ideas, and you have you've created a very large monoculture, which is pretty unhealthy.